Joined this afternoon by Professor Miriam Altman. She's a former National Planning Commissioner. She's also a director at Altman Advisory. Prof, great to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed for coming on. The President saying he believes continuity is important insofar as structural reforms are concerned in the country and policy direction is concerned in the country. We did get off to a slow start, which may lead some of us to ask the question, you know, is change not needed rather than a continuation of what the President had in mind?
I think we definitely need a continuation of the programs that have been started. They've been hard won. And what you don't want to do is shake it up. You know, the DA may have different views about what its capability is, but one of the problems with when it's come into power in other parts of the country is that it seems to think that it does need to shake things up. And sometimes you've got good programs running. So the kinds of projects that you're seeing in Operation Vulindlela and other parts of the country around energy reform, freight transport reform, even passenger transport in water, city turnaround programs are absolutely critical, and we need to carry on with this transformation. It's quite a difficult thing to do, no matter who's driving it.
Sure. I mean, the President says, you know, we've come a long way in the reform journey. There is still a lot to be done. He admits to try and reignite growth in our economy and obviously try and create more jobs in our economy. You know, how do we do that? How do we ensure that we stay on track with the reforms started in the 6th administration and move out of that 1% growth rate that we seem to be stuck in?
Well, firstly, we've got a long way to go. Let's just not make a mistake of thinking that that's not the case. And this kind of reform process we're in, countries go through it. Many, many countries do. And there are winners and losers and people who fight back in every single country where it happens. It's hard work. So you need a certain amount of political stability. It doesn't mean it has to be the same party, but you need a certain amount of commitment to that program and amount of certainty so everybody understands that we're doing it. And introducing, for example, competition. You still have the government leading infrastructure delivery. It has to, because of the time horizons on this kind of infrastructure and the kind of financial requirements. The state has to lead it, actually. But the private sector can execute on it. They can partner on it. They can finance it. And we're starting to open out to that. Now, that takes a lot of, you know, firstly, as I say, winners and losers, a lot of capacity development on both sides, including in relation to partnering. The ability to grow, we unfortunately, when I was National Planning Commissioner, you were referring to me as that, you know, we looked at this issue that we've had very low growth for probably 50, 60 years, with only a few years of you know, sort of plus 3% kind of growth, about an average of 1.5% since the 1960s, generally. And the question is actually what we need to do to create jobs is very simple. We're just not doing those things. So, for example, urban densification, you know, jobs are about one thing leading to another. The cost of living would fall if people were living more centrally, if passenger transport were working well, if people had access to nutritious food more easily, if the education system were more functional. It is getting more functional. I know people may not believe that, but remember that if you were Black, you weren't supposed to finish matric 30 years ago. Let's remember. So, you know, but the reality is we need to do better on the human level, on the appointment of people in leadership positions, both in the private and the public sector. These are things that would immediately contribute to faster economic growth and job creation.
And a lot of this hinges on the formation of this next government, right? But the President has said that, broadly speaking, there is support for the continuation, no matter what the 7th administration looks like. There is support for the continuation of these economic reforms, which is good news, given what you've just said. Sure.
You know, the ANC, we're not used to the idea of a minority government. So whether it's a coalition or whatever gets formed, the ANC fundamentally still has 40% of the vote and will be leading this government. And so what it needs to do is lead and continue with these excellent programs, improving performance, of state-owned infrastructure and other areas, it needs to lead, no matter who it partners with. So when the DA, I was listening to your last insert, and it says the DA's got great relationships with the United States. The ANC leads the foreign policy agenda. The DA is not supposed to have those relationships. I mean, they can if they want to, but they're not supposed to be leading those things when they're in opposition in terms of foreign affairs. And now if they're part of government, maybe they'll have that role. But the ANC has relationships all around the world because it manages our foreign relations. And we have very big commercial relationships with the United States, the EU, the UK, and also with China and India.
And what you're talking about, Prof. Altman, in part is also about, I suppose, investor confidence, right? When so many of the investors are coming from countries like the US, the UK, continuing with this agenda, this reform agenda, hopefully we sort of retain that investor confidence and attract that investor confidence.
Well, so South Africa generally has a low foreign direct investment profile. It has for as long as I can remember, certainly during apartheid and even post. A lot of the foreign investment we get is into the JSE, and we've got a very liquid financial markets compared to most developing countries. So a lot of the flows tend to be like that. It's not the best thing for the country, but it tends to be how it goes. And it's the local investment that becomes very important. And there's no doubt that it would be great to have more foreign investment. There's no doubt about it. But just to say, that's generally how things run. The more financial stability that there is in the country, the more certainty, in other words, fiscal certainty, the greater commitment, not necessarily to fiscal consolidation, but to financial stability. Enables the continuation of funding of key programs. It enables financial stability for the private financial sector. Those things are absolutely important to any kind of investment, because particularly if you're making long-range investments, like, for example, the embedded generation kinds of projects, the big infrastructure investments that the private sector are now committing to, you need to know that you can stay in with this for the long haul.
Prof, you've obviously got a bird's eye view as a former commissioner. But for the woman and the man on the street looking to the NDP, for example, and looking to that 2030 deadline, when so many of our goals were meant to be realized in terms of education, the provision of water and sanitation, housing, access to data, and the list goes on and on, we have fallen incredibly short of the 2030 goal. And, for those who are bearing the brunt still of apartheid and post-94 South Africa, it's very difficult to expect them to say, yes, we have faith in your development agenda and we agree that we should continue on this plan.
So it's not so much the plan that's the problem, as they often say. It's about, execution. And in a number of years ago, I often talk about it on your programs, Newzroom Afrika, is we put out a report from the NPC in 2020 when we finished our terms, or maybe it was 2021, as to where we are in relation to the plan. What the plan does is it says, if you want to give life to the commitments in the Constitution, which is essentially what you're talking about in terms of quality of life and that everybody can live a decent life, then what the NDP does, it says this is how you're going to get there. And what we did to write those reports is we went over all the commitments in the plan and said, where are we against those? And are they still relevant? And certainly they are. I just outlined some of them. In relation to, we did a huge amount of work on state-owned, on state infrastructure when we wrote that report, and the quality of the state-owned enterprises and how they get reformed. Quality of education and how it links to economic opportunity, densification of housing, the ability of people to own an asset that can, like a house that can appreciate in value, is a critical way of creating class mobility for people, stuff like that. That's still right. You know, it's still right. A lot of the things we said around, you know, you may want to do less government housing and more self-build, but it should be in areas that are near economic opportunity and not far from them, just as an example. Still relevant, right?
Absolutely.
Right. So the point is, it's like when the UN, I often give this example, if the UN says there's targets around child nutrition, child development, education, women's rights, that sort of thing. And then if you say, well, we didn't achieve those targets, you don't change those targets, right? There's no doubt that you need to achieve them. If you miss them, you have to re-strategize and ask yourself how you're going to get there.
Yeah.
So you gotta, you know, you have to, you know, set aside your crocodile tears. You know, it's just, you got to stand up and then say, well, how do we get there? Because all those things are things we want. An inclusive economy, a decent life for everybody, etc. Those things are still relevant. You know, diversification of industry, all of those things. We have to stand up and say, so how do we get there now? And the plan laid out, I think, still quite a relevant pathway to get there. We're not going to get to those targets necessarily by 2030, but we still have to try. And so the creative element is not so much in finding new things to do, but to apply ourselves to better ways of getting there. So, for example, I was part of writing the National Infrastructure Plan for the Department of Public Works in the past few years. And there's one half of it that is going to be coming out soon. It was just approved by Cabinet a few months ago. And it speaks to, just to take an example, strengthening maintenance of infrastructure. Now, the current mechanism, because of limited budgets, you may have seen this in your own neighborhood around water, you know, or roads, is that the cities wait until the infrastructure breaks to fix it. I'm sure you've seen it, and I'm sure your viewers have seen it. I've seen it on my own street. So, you know, and that's what they're told to do. So you're supposed to repair a road when it's in bad condition, not in good condition. The best time to repair a road is when it's in good condition, because then you don't have to completely renew the road, right? But the reality is, you know, government feels that it doesn't have enough money to do that. But on the flip side, it doesn't have enough money not to do it that way, because it's a fraction of the cost to maintain the infrastructure. It would dramatically improve infrastructure performance to be preempting water leaks, preempting road failure, etc. But people are guided to not do that. So if we can start thinking about the life cycle of infrastructure in that way, I'm just giving one example, it would dramatically improve the performance of spending on infrastructure and the quality of services.
Yeah, sure.
So it's not rocket science, but these are small things that could really move the dial in the value of money that's spent in the quality of life, just as examples.
Yeah, so you're saying these things are still relevant, Professor Altman. I would say, you know, when it comes to service delivery, it's everything. It's everything to some communities who are struggling with certain issues around service delivery. Prof. Altman, let me thank you for your time this afternoon. Professor Miriam Altman is a former National Planning Commissioner.